All right, folks, welcome back to Mike and Maurice's Mind Escape. We have episode number 55 today, Near Death Experiences with Dr. Penny Sartori. Check us out at Mike and Maurice mindescape.com, patreon.com/Mike and Maurice. Also, check out our new YouTube page, Ancient Secrets. Without further ado, author and researcher Dr. Penny Sartori. How are you doing?
Hi, I'm good. How are you?
Good, good. Um, so I learned about your work through somebody on Twitter. They had, said, "Hey, I like your page. Check Dr. Penny out." And I started looking at your stuff, and I really enjoyed it. It hit close to home. My mom had a near-death experience with some of the main hallmarks that and patterns you see um, in your books, and uh, hers was though she was giving birth to my youngest sister and had passed for a few minutes on the table. And even when she came back, she was asked by um, the doctor, did you have, he knew something along those lines already before she even said anything. So obviously this has been going on for a long time. Doctors are aware of it. It's not like a hidden thing. So how did you get into this?
It was through my job because I used to work as a nurse and I was in intensive care for 17 years working. And really early on in my career, I realized that death is just so common. You know, you'd see 3 or 4 people die in just one 8-hour shift. So that kind of brought the reality of how precious life is to me. But then it was during a night shift when I was looking after a man who was dying, and he knew he was dying, and we were doing everything that we could to keep him alive and to stop him from dying. And it resulted in him having a very traumatic and suffering death. And that really upset me because as this man, as a nurse, I had a routine to look after the patients. And the beginning of the routine was to give the patients a bed bath before they went off to sleep for the night. And this man had just come back from the operating room, and he was in tremendous pain. And as I adjusted the bed just to wash him, he was in so much agony, he nearly jumped out of bed. And our eyes connected. And when our eyes connected, it felt like I'd swapped places with him, and I knew what he was going through. And he couldn't talk, but he was mouthing the words to me, leave me alone, let me die, just let me die in peace. And that just had an incredible effect on me. It really shocked me. So I called the doctor and we gave some extra painkillers. But the only thing that I could do to settle that man was to sit with him and hold his hand. And it was after that that I started thinking, what is death all about? Is death that bad that we've got to put patients through this to prevent it from happening? And I thought we're all going to die. And so then it started me thinking about death, and I started reading about death. And then I came across near-death experiences. And I read about it was the book actually by Betty Eady called Embraced by the Light. That was the first book I ever read on near-death experiences. And I read it, but because my nurse training was very scientific, I just thought, oh gosh, this has got to be some sort of, it's the brain shutting down and things like that. And I was looking for those scientific explanations of it. And then I was really kind of curious about them. So I read another book on near death experiences, and then another one and another one. And I became obsessed with them. And I just thought, well, I'm just working in the perfect place to do my own research. And by a series of synchronicities, I ended up then doing some research at the hospital where I worked. So I was lucky enough then to have supervisors. There was Professor Paul Badham and also Dr. Peter Fennick, and they were both experts. They are both experts in the field of near-death experiences. And back in 19, oh God, where are we now? 1997, the research began, and I did a pilot study in the summer of 1997, and then the formal study started in January 1998, and the data collection went on for 5 years, and then it took me a further 3 years to write up the data and to analyze it.
Yeah, I believe in your book. Yeah, you say you started in '97 at the beginning of the wisdom of near-death experiences, and also that's how your book began. The story you told about the older gentleman that you had been overseeing in that experience. Now, you said you were looking at it from initially from a scientific and analytical standpoint. Um, was there something um, like, did you start to correlate maybe some of these people were religious or had been open to mystical experiences, and maybe the people that don't, because I know there are a group of people that don't experience anything. They say it's just black. I see a near death
Mm.
experience boards and different threads and stuff. Oh, there's nothing after. I didn't see anything. And I had, a near death experience. So did you think initially that those two things were correlated or?
Yeah, I thought of that possibility. So the patients who I interviewed, I sort of got their background data as well. So I looked at things like, were they religious or did they go to church? How religious were they? Were they not at all religious? Um, and to be honest with you, it didn't have much of an influence at all, really. I think people were, and one thing I did find with the near death experience, like you just said, now some people have nothing and it's just kind of black. And I did, when I suppose I did have expectations when I started doing my research. And I thought that I would uncover near death experiences like the ones I'd read about in other people's books. But what I found was that some of the experiences I came across were quite fragmentary as well. So people remembered little bits of them, but not the full experience like I'd been reading about. There were a couple of them who did have that full kind of experience, but some of them just were little bits of them. So I think quality of the near-death experience as well can vary. That's why I'm hoping there's going to be a lot more research in the future to follow on from the kind of research that I did. And as well with the outer body experience, that's another aspect I was looking at. And I was trying to see if I could verify what these people were reporting as well. And so, what I did with the outer body component to investigate that, I had hidden targets at the bedside of each person, and they were mounted off the wall. They each bedside had a cardiac monitor, and it was about say 8 foot mounted off the floor. And so I hid these targets on the top of these monitors, and they were concealed behind ridges. So the only way you could view these targets was if you were out of your body. And I hope that if someone claimed to have the outer body experience and they correctly identified that target, that would be a way of verifying that the outer body experience is accurate. But what I did find with my research is the quality of the outer body experience that varied as well according to the patients. So, for example, some patients didn't float high enough out of their body. They were just a little bit above their body. So they could see their body looking down, but they weren't high enough to view that symbol. Another man had no control over his experiences, so he'd be out of his body, but he would float into the middle of the room and not to the side of the room where the targets were situated. But there were two patients who had the outer body experience that was of the quality where they were able to view the targets, but both of those patients said that they were so interested in what was going on around their body that they weren't looking for hidden targets anywhere. So no one correctly identified the targets, but none of them claimed to see the targets either. No, none of the patients were aware of them. So, it was a lot of hard work to try and do that. And some people say to me, well, Pen, what was the point in doing that research? But I think it's important that we do it because one lady wrote to me and she said she was in hospital many years ago and she'd left her body and she actually floated up to the cardiac monitor and she was a nurse, but she said she wasn't able to read what was on the screen. So some people might have that ability where they're able to approach the monitor or be in a position to see the targets. But equally, if you get hundreds of people who claim to have that experience but still don't see the targets, well, that can give us some very valuable information as well. So yeah, so that was an interesting aspect.
Now, have you ever looked, based on your experiment, sounds like what happens during some sort of psychedelic disassociative experience, maybe similar to ketamine about the floating outside of your body. Um, do you know of anybody that's ever studied near death experience in association with psychedelics, possibly dimethyltryptamine, since it's produced in the body? Or, is there, we were talking about a possible, scientific or chemical explanation. Not that that would even rule out something metaphysical either, but just that that's maybe the gateway into that realm.
Yeah, no, Carl Janssen did some research looking at the NMDA receptor within the brain. There's been some studies done, Rick Strassman's work on the DMT, the spirit molecule. That's really interesting. But what you find with the near-death experience and the psychedelic drug experiences is they vary, because with the near-death experience, you can't plan to go out and have one. It's one of these things that just comes out of the blue.
Right.
Um, when someone kind of takes the psychedelic drugs, it's done with some form of expectation as well. So they
Mhm.
kind of know what it is that they expect out of the experience. So I think there's slight differences there in the context and the setting. But I think what they both experiences are doing are accessing this deep altered state of consciousness that we're normally not aware of. And so there's many different routes to accessing this. And
Mhm.
I think perhaps the near-death experience is just one that is completely unexpected.
Yeah, no, I mean that totally makes sense. And the only reason why I said that too is there's a lot of, shamans and people that have had major experiences talk about how they felt like they died and they were brought to like an underworld where they were then pieced back together and sent back kind of into reality. So that aspect I kind of identified with some of the different hallmarks of the near death, which is some people see family members, some people see Jesus. And then you're told your time isn't now, or you've got this left to do, or you've still got kids back, or whatever the case may be. And then they get sent back and it's boom, they're back in their body.
Well, that's kind of like what the explanation, people were saying an explanation for having one, what might be you release a ton of DMT or whatever.
Mhm.
Obviously, we don't know that, so
Yeah, that's it. That's the thing. When you're doing all this research, all we're doing is scratching the surface, and it makes me realize how much more there is to understand about these experiences. I remember at the beginning of my research, Dr. Peter Fenwick said to me, at the end of this 5 years, what are you going to come back with? And I just thought, well, I'm going to have all the answers. And how naive was that? Because,
yeah.
this has raised far more questions than what it's answered for me, and it's still a mystery to me now after all these years of studying it. There's still things that we don't understand.
The other thing I took away when you were telling your story of your experiment is maybe when you get into that state of mind, what's ever happening in this realm just doesn't matter anymore, So
Yeah,
they they
absolutely.
disregard, the test that you're giving them because it's just such a different plane of existence.
Yeah, that's right, exactly. Yes.
Do you have you ever, or has anybody ever looked into, um and I know this is the talk with people trying to study like dimethyltryptamine would be trying to tap into, not like in a invasive way, but just while somebody's either passing or maybe somebody signs something, says, hey, I'm dying, you can study my, or monitor me, or whatever you need to do. Has that ever been talked about, or is that just not ethical?
Probably you wouldn't get ethical approval for it, not at this precise moment in time. So no, I'm not aware of anyone who's done that, but there would be probably it would be problematic to get ethical approval.
You have my word right now. If something happens to me, somebody's got
Yeah,
approval. Let's get this thing figured out.
I'll
Um,
come in with a little chisel and see what's going on.
um, so back to your work though, when you started it sounds like it started with all the older people that you were helping. Did you branch your work off into the different realms of other near death experiences that had like non-age related, meaning somebody that had been in a car accident, or, and I know a lot of them are related to cardiac arrest, but is there other, is there other, near death experiences that you were helping, that you were studying? Or did you branch off into the different realms of other near death experiences that had, you know, like non-age related, meaning somebody that had been in a car accident, or, and I know a lot of them are related to cardiac arrest, but subgroups that you think are important that have different properties?
I think all kind of a near-death experience can happen in all different contexts. So in my research in the hospital, there were people who'd had road traffic accidents, people who'd had surgery, people who were undergoing an emergency, medical emergency, people who'd had cardiac arrests. There's all different things. And then if you look at the other aspect of my research where people have written to me over the years and emailed me about their experiences, you can also get them through all sorts of things. It's very common during childbirth and complications of childbirth, as you mentioned with your mum.
Hmm.
There with drowning, near drowning, it's very common. In the dentist, actually, years ago, they used to have the gas.
Hmm.
And I've got so many cases of young children who'd been given gas in the dentist and they'd had the near-death experience. So it's kind of all kinds of all sort of illnesses can trigger a near-death experience. In the hospital research that I did in particular, what the most frequent component of the near-death experience that was reported was meeting deceased relatives. That was the most common experience. And then feelings of this peace and calm and joy and wanting to stay where they were. That was the most common thing, you know. The strongest case was the case of patient 10. And he said when he was having his near-death experience, all of his pain had just disappeared. He was so happy. He felt blissful. He wanted to stay where he was.
Yeah.
But during his experience, he'd met this Jesus type figure who said, no, you've got to go back. It's not your time. And he said, you know, when he was back in his body, he was just in immediate pain. And that pain was so bad that he really did wish that he had died at that point as well. So,
That's interesting. So on that topic, yeah, my mom during her experience saw my deceased grandfather, her father, and my deceased sister who had complications early in her life and passed away when she was 3. But she saw my sister when she was like fully grown up and had a different form basically. And I know and the same thing they told the both, you know, my I think my grandfather told her it's not your time, it's the most beautiful thing when it is, but it's not your time, you got to go back. And then she was basically back in her body hearing the doctor, you know, try and talk or things going on in the background. um During those experiences, like you said, the Jesus one, I've watched a lot of videos. A lot of people see Jesus. Do you think that that's, um, you know, an archetype? Since most people don't even we don't even know what Jesus really looked like.
yeah, that's right. I think it is. And if you look at Carl Jung's work on archetypes and the collective unconscious, I think what people are doing during the near-death experience is tapping into that collective unconscious and the archetypal forms, and they're interpreting those forms according to the imagery that they've been brought up with, you know. It's so even if someone's not particularly religious, we still see images of Jesus and religious images around us anyway as part of our culture. And perhaps in the subconscious, they're buried in our subconscious, even if we have no belief. And during the near-death experience, they can be activated then if they tune into that collective unconsciousness.
So do you so you associate that maybe, you know, I've heard, okay, so in Proof of Heaven, I'm sure you're familiar with Dr. Eben Alexander's work. He talks about these like light orbs that once you get to this next realm, there's these light orbs and you hear this beautiful music and there's all this stuff. Most people see these light orbs. I've heard people taking psychedelics seen them. I've heard people associate them with even like UFOs and aliens, but they are this thing that people experience. Do you think that these are the things that are just taking form, whatever, you know, I know this is hypothetical and complete speculation, but do you think those two things are associated?
Yeah, they could well be. You know, there's this imagery that people are picking up on, and it's how they interpret it. It's, you know, energy form at the end of the day, whether it's a
Right.
light or not. It's a form of energy that they're picking up on. So yeah, and another thing that's really interesting about Eben's experience, he said that he could feel like these waves of energy as well. I've met Eben quite a few times, and he was saying, you know, these waves, and he realized on reflection that that was the prayers that people were saying around him. as well. And he was able to feel the energy from those prayers. And I find that really fascinating as well, you know?
Yeah, that is
Oh yeah.
fascinating. And the other thing too is a lot of these things can correlate. Like even if you don't believe in religion or whatever, even somebody's praying. What is praying? It's positive intent. You know, we know positive energy can be quantified through. I think what's that Japanese scientist that
Yeah, he makes
he would freeze the
snowflakes.
snowflakes, and if it was like evil or heavy music, it would be an ugly form, and if it was beautiful music, um, it would take the shape of, you know, a beautiful
Crystal.
crystalline, you know. So we know that, you know, even people that speak to their plants, and you know, there's been research on that. But oh, the guy's name's Masaru Emoto, the Japanese researcher. But yeah, so do you think that that has an impact, like in terms of what you're saying? He said he felt prayer. We know, you know, laws of attraction, kind of, that, you know, if you constantly putting positive energy out there, you're going to get that positive energy back. People that are self-loathing, poor me, usually generate more of that kind of a thing.
Yeah, I think so. And in fact, there was some work done back in, I think it was the 1980s, when Dr. Randolph Bird published a paper on the power of prayer. And he did some trials on patients who'd been prayed for and some who didn't know that they'd been prayed for. And what they found is that the group who'd been prayed for actually had better outcomes than the other ones, less requirement of antibiotics and
Yep.
less ventilation as well. So that was interesting. And through my observations, not through any scientific study, but I have noticed over the years, we've had one patient in particular sticks in my mind, and she was really close to death. And I know her family were praying, but they had a very well connected prayer group throughout England, and there were hundreds and hundreds of people praying for her at the same time. And despite expectations of her probably not surviving, she did survive. So, you know, maybe there is something in it. And that would be a lovely study to do and follow on with as well, you know, how powerful prayer could be. So, you know, there are so many unknowns and so many things that need investigating.
Yeah.
What do you like, what truths have you taken from this then? You know, as you just said, there are so many variables. What are some things that you have taken away that you can say this is some solid or viable evidence here?
Well, I think without a doubt, near-death experiences happen and they're very real to the people who have them. And there are some things about near-death experiences that we can no longer just dismiss or attribute to the drugs or things like that. With my research, I tried to find an explanation. So I'd looked at the drugs that we give the patients, and they're often cited as a cause for the near-death experience. But with
Uh-huh.
my research, what I found is that those who had been given drugs were less likely to have an experience. So those who had had large amounts of painkilling or sedative drugs actually didn't report anything at all. So in fact, the drugs that we give were more likely to have an inhibiting effect on near-death experiences. Certainly the case of patient 10, when he reported the out-of-body experience, everything that he reported was very accurate. And I know it was accurate because I was there at the time it was happening. I was the nurse looking after him. And the things that he reported were at the time when he was the most deeply unconscious and he was not responding to deep painful stimuli or anything. Yet when he regained consciousness, he very accurately described which doctor had examined him, although he hadn't seen that doctor prior to losing consciousness.
Wow.
He correctly identified my kind of actions and also the actions of the physiotherapist. And while the physiotherapist was there, she was poking her head around the curtains. That man was completely unconscious and his eyes were closed, yet he reported watching her poking her head around the curtains. Everything that he described was completely accurate, but he was just completely unconscious. And if you consider the current materialist explanation that consciousness is produced by the brain, well, that just doesn't fit in with it at all. So I think
Yeah.
the biggest thing I've come across with my research is the need to explore consciousness from another perspective, because the materialist perspective that the brain produces consciousness is not factual. I don't think it's correct at all, and we really need to expand our understanding of consciousness.
Oh, I 100% agree.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
actually, you look at like a Sean Carroll, who's a physicist, and he's saying, he's all over the internet saying it is a byproduct, just like how you can't see oxygen, but it's there and we're breathing it, kind of a thing. And you got like a Brian Cox from your, end of the pond, and Kevin or Maurice doesn't appreciate his work much, but so these are people that are just reductionists. That's their job, is to kind of deduct and keep doing the scientific method and stuff. But from a standpoint of we need to research it more, I think you're right, because we don't, as much as those people are intelligent and do great stuff, they don't have all the answers. And I'm not saying we shouldn't turn to science and shouldn't turn, but I think there needs to be an understanding that all they're doing is quantifying um, material things and measuring them, and then um, basically saying this is what our findings are. Now, to me, that's great, but it doesn't talk about the things that we don't know, like you said, like consciousness. And I think there's been studies, a lot of people have taken a poke at this, even Roger Penrose with Roger Hammeroff and their lattice A and lattice B, um, you know, microtubule studies and stuff like that. So, is there anything else that, from a scientific standpoint, that would make sense to you, or is it something that you truly believe is some sort of metaphysical thing that we could probably figure out, but since we're not even looking there, that's not even an option right now?
Yeah, I think because we're not looking, we just coming at it from that materialist perspective, and because it doesn't fit into the materialist perspective, we just dismiss it offhandedly. And I think what we need to do is look at it from that find a different way of looking at it. To me, it makes far more sense through the research that I've done and from the studies that I've done to consider the brain as a receiver or transceiver of consciousness rather than a producer of consciousness. And what makes most sense to me is that the brain is acting like a filter, and consciousness is primary. It's around us all the time. We're not aware of this heightened state of consciousness because the brain screens it out. And there are times when that filter action of the brain becomes more relaxed, as it would do if someone was close to death or during a near-death situation, or perhaps under the influence of psychedelic drugs. That filter action relaxes, and rather than create an experience, all it's doing is allowing that heightened state of reality into everyday consciousness. And that makes more sense to me. And I think it's better if we can explore that aspect and it's not a new theory. These theories have kind of been bandied about for years and years. You look at Henri Bergson and Aldous Huxley, they've all kind of looked
Yeah.
at suggested this in the past. So it's not a new idea. It's just something that's never actually been researched in depth or developed into more of an understanding of consciousness. But I think we're at that point now where we are getting scientific data about near-death experiences, where we have to take this seriously and we have to look at it with a more of an open mind if we really truly want to understand consciousness.
Well, yeah, we need to go down a different road because it's not leading us where we need to be. It's I don't know. But I had a quick question. Are you a religious person at all, or I know you're sounds like you're pretty spiritual, but
Yeah, I'm not religious at all. In fact, when I started doing my research, I was an atheist, and I can remember having this very negative attitude about God and religion and everything. But
Mhm.
I think doing my research has opened my mind a lot, and I would consider myself to be spiritual as opposed to religious.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, I think most people that study these topics and esoteric work and different things, they might have been brought up in a traditional religious environment, but then tend to understand that maybe there's not a bearded guy in the sky, and maybe it's some pure energy or pure light or something along those lines, where it's not necessarily Zeus up on a cloud. So I think that, like I said, I think the more you study this stuff, And I think you can still have faith that there is some sort of metaphysical thing that we just don't understand. And I think that's all religion is predicated around anyway. So,
Yeah, that's right. I can remember I grew up being fearful of God. I thought there was this man in the sky looking
hmm,
down at me, watching my every wrong move, and I was terrified. And then I became angry at God for letting things happen. But now I kind of think of perhaps consciousness is God. God is consciousness, and maybe look at it from that perspective as well.
yeah,
Um,
no, I mean, totally. Have you ever looked into Rupert Sheldrake's work with morphic resonance and how maybe inanimate objects might also have some level of consciousness as well?
yes, yes. And that is a possibility. And I know Stanislav Grof as well. And we were at a conference together a few years ago, and I was lucky enough to spend the day with him. And he said that, he's had experiences when he was working with his LSD and holotropic breath work of actually being the consciousness of a tree that was in his vicinity and being the consciousness of a rock. And he said it's a very different state of consciousness to what human consciousness is. But during his psychedelic experiences, his altered states of consciousness were where he assumed different entities like the trees and the rocks. And that was
Right.
a conversation.
No,
Yeah.
it sounds
Yeah, that's pretty
interesting.
crazy.
You said something about consciousness being everywhere or consciousness being a thing that, like maybe that's the the secret to life in the cosmos is maybe there needs to be um the receiver for the signal, if that makes sense. Like maybe we've evolved to the point where, like you said, we are this beacon or this thing that consciousness can inhabit, but in terms of um do you think that when we do more research that we will find that most brain activity, whether the consciousness part of the brain, is actually receiving something and taking some sort of energy wave particles, something, because we know photons, obviously, like that's how we see everything that you know that's how we put everything together, and I think, isn't it 50% of our brain is putting visuals together based on memory alone? That's part of it too. So
Yeah, I don't know really. It could be that the brain in some way acts as a focal point for this consciousness and it streams through the brain and then we interpret it from a human perspective. Because I think if we were exposed to that consciousness as it is, it would be too overwhelming for us in a human body. We wouldn't be able to function. And so it's kind of streamlined and we only get that very dumbed down version of it unless you have some sort of experience like the near death experience where it kind of opens up fully, if you like. But
sure.
then what goes beyond that as well, after someone actually does die, it will be always be beyond our comprehension until we experience it ourselves in its entirety at our own death. That's the only time we're really gonna kind of get the answers when we die ourselves.
Well, and that's the interesting thing about the near death experience is we are pretty much, well, I don't think we're getting an objective view of it, but we are at least getting a version from the observer, like, and that's important, I think, because everything we know is based on we are the observer. We are the only thing that matters that is, you know, if we weren't if human beings didn't exist and let's say there is no life anywhere else, then nothing would really matter, would it?
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. It wouldn't. Yeah, it's a really you can get into some really deep thought and deep
Yeah.
Sorry.
that as well.
um no, I know we get into some serious
Mm.
speculation here, but yeah, in terms of when you do these experiments, do you go in with an idea of what you want to do ahead of time, or is it something that just evolves as you're doing it?
Well, when I did my research, I kind of went in with some preconceived ideas, and I had these hidden targets, and I had a series of questions that I asked the patients. But these are things that are really beyond our control. You don't know which patients are going to have the experience. For the first year, I interviewed everyone who survived their admission to the intensive care unit, and that was just like too much work because I found I was spending more time in the hospital than I was at home. So when I modified it then to just people who'd had the cardiac arrest, I was also getting some patients who were reporting the experience but didn't have the cardiac arrest in other situations. So although I went in with some preconceived ideas, it didn't always go to plan as what I thought as well. And when patients did have the a cardiac arrest, I thought, great, they're bound to have had a near-death experience, but they didn't. Most of them didn't remember anything at all. It's quite a rare phenomenon if you consider how many patients actually do have a cardiac arrest. There's only about it depends whose research you look at, between about 11 and 20% of people who do have a cardiac arrest, they report the near-death experience. But then people say to me, well, what about the other 80 odd percent who didn't recall an experience? And is it because they didn't have a near-death experience, or is it because they had no recall of the experience? And that is something that interests me because I've come across a few cases where people had near-death circumstances, but they didn't recall anything. But at a later date, they went back to that point and they recalled a near-death experience. So what I'm getting at here, I'll give you the example of one lady. She wrote to me many years ago. She'd been attacked in her home and she was left for dead and she lost consciousness, and she remembers her attacker punched her in the chin. She fell over, knocked her head on the floor, and that's all she remembers. It was just going black. It went black. And then 6 months later, she had to go into hospital for surgery because she'd had her nose broken in the attack. She went to have her nose reset. And when she went into unconsciousness, when they went under anesthesia, she recalled a near-death experience where she found herself back in the house, and she was reliving that attack. But this time when she was punched, she fell to the floor and she recalled a full near-death experience as well. So,
Wow.
and so is it that people do have the experience, but they don't have the recall of it? So that would be another interesting research study to do as well.
Do you think that there might be a correlation to like how when we dream, when you
Yeah.
wake up, you immediately remember the dream for a second. It's a little blurry, and then you go about your day and you don't even think about it again. At least that's my perspective on it.
Yeah, because some people do. Some people have recollections of dreams. Some people don't at all, or you may remember it briefly and then forget completely about it. Yeah, it could well be. But what people do recall, though, when they do have a near-death experience and they recall it immediately, they say it's so vivid that it's etched in their mind for the rest of their life. So they may have the
Yeah.
near-death experience in childhood, and it remains just as vivid if they're 80 years of age. It's just really the recall of it. They can just close their eyes and it's as if they're reliving it there and then. They have total recall of it. It's such a vivid experience.
The thing I find most fascinating about the topic um, is the patient or person having the experience. They're seeing dead relatives or people that were young when they died, but they're old now and they're in beautiful, white, togas. And I've heard even people talk about not seeing hands or feet too. I've seen that in quite a few people's experiences. Have you looked into that? Is that something that you have an idea about?
Really looked into it. But yeah, you're right. Some people don't recall seeing the feet and things like that. Some people might see their relatives. The images that they have of their relatives before their relatives die might be where they were looking really quite emaciated and, really not in a good state, where when they see them during the near-death experience, they're radiant again and they look younger and they're wearing nice clothes. They look really healthy. So it's a contrast to what their last images were of the person as well. One patient in my hospital study, he recalled seeing his grandfather, and his grandfather had had a stroke before he died. And so he was always sitting in the chair and he was kind of hunched over. But during the near-death experience, he was there looking radiant, surrounded by light, looking really, really healthy. So there's often a contrast. And sometimes, if people have had like an amputation in this life,
Hmm.
during the near-death experience, they can look whole again and they can have their legs back and things like that.
Do you think that that is a hallmark of something that signifies that it is metaphysical? Because, I mean, our brains are amazing. I'm not debating that, but to come up with in that experience every single time to see people that are dead or have died in perfect form, like most people, I don't dream like that, and I'm sure most people that have these experiences haven't had weird dreams like that. So do you think that that is a correlation to something beyond then, since that is a very specific thing that happens?
It could well be. We don't know really. It might well be, but I don't know. It's a difficult one to answer. So
Yeah,
yeah.
if it was a dream, it's crazy because it would be a similar dream in regards where a lot of people see their dead relatives and stuff. So it's like a collective dream
Mhm.
that they have. I don't know. It's very interesting to me. I was gonna
Yeah.
ask you, what are your thoughts of death? What do you think happens after you pass on?
Well, I think got a rough idea of the initial stages of that, and perhaps I will go through a tunnel, meet up with dead relatives, and be really happy or pain free and blissful. I might have the negative or the distressing kind of near death experiences as well, because not all of them are pleasant. Some of them can be really quite distressing and unpleasant. So there could be that. There could be like that void experience of just complete blackness. And we can describe this void as being eternal boredom as well, just kind of being in that eternal boredom state. So I don't know, but I think the fact that I've done this research into near-death experiences will help me to recognize the different stages. Then what perhaps is beyond those stages, I really don't know until it happens at my own death. But I think an interesting thing as well is lucid dreams and how if you were able to have control over your dreams or to train your mind in a way to control your dreams, then we might have some initial control over the initial stage of our death as well. So that's an interesting thing because I'm doing a conference with lucid dreamers in the Netherlands in June of this year, and that's an interesting conference, and I'm looking forward to that, to meeting up with people who do lucid dreaming as well, because I think that can give us some degree of control, I think, as we do pass.
Yeah, that
Well,
sounds awesome.
yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I know, I don't know who they were, what, but old Buddhist monks would train their minds, and they would
Mhm.
do a lot of training with lucid dreaming because they believed that when they passed on, that there was a location that they all could go to. So maybe
Yeah.
there is some validity to that.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So, and I think it's important to kind of explore these things as well. So,
Have you ever looked into ancient? I know the whole movement kind of started, or at least the term, with Raymond Moody and From Life After Life, 1975. Do you think that, or have you ever looked into like how ancient Egyptians approach the subject? Have you ever delved into any of those topics, or is that something that you just
yeah,
you don't find
kind of
important to your work?
yeah, I've had a look into all of those, and certainly in the early stages of my research, I was fascinated by all kind of cultural influences about death and the practices of the ancient Egyptians, because ancient Egypt as well is another thing that I'm really fascinated by, and how the pyramids are and how they were built, and they're not just tombs of kings, are they?
Hmm.
They're far more than that. So, but yeah, I think all of the ancient cultures, they had perhaps a deeper understanding of death than what we do, and they were far more aware of these things. And the Oracle of Delphi and things like that, and there's so much things, and all of these things were, in a way, that suggests that they were regularly accessing altered states of consciousness as well. So they had some understanding of it that that we don't. And if you like, our culture has lost touch with all things like that. You know, the ancient cultures were very knowledgeable, and we seem to have lost touch with those cultural aspects.
Have you ever looked into Dorothy Eady?
No, I haven't.
Okay,
No.
so just a brief overview. She was, I think she was born in Britain, and she was taken to a museum where, when she was a kid, where she saw the pharaohs or some exhibit, and she started to kneel down at the feet of one of the pharaohs and kiss it and start saying all this crazy stuff. And she went on to help most of the or a lot of Egyptologists of the time find certain sites. She knew where stuff is. She thought she knew that she was a priestess from um, the polytheistic days of early ancient Egypt, and she found all these sites and had a huge influence on early Egyptology. But that's like one of the more credible reincarnation stories. And have you ever looked into that aspect from the near death end of things?
Well, yeah, that was another thing that really fascinated me, especially when I first got into my research, because there was this whole field of knowledge that I was totally unaware of. And so I started looking into things like reincarnation as well, and past lives and things like that. Roger Woolger's work on past life regression. He was a Jungian analyst who did some work on past life. And what he found with his work was that if people had sort of hang-ups in this life, if they went back during his therapy to a previous life and addressed that thing, the ailment in this life would very often be resolved.
Mm.
So that is, really fascinating. And then I looked at all different things for reincarnation as well. And it's just such a fascinating topic. And Professor Ian Stevenson and his work in the University of Virginia, and how different cultures embrace the reincarnational aspect as well. And he found thousands of cases. His books are just so thick and full of different cases. And so he's just, one person, and there's perhaps a handful of other people who have done work like his. So we need to be doing more work into those fields, and learning more, because there's just so much that we don't know, and so much ready to be uncovered as well.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, I'm totally open to the pure material idea of things if they were to find evidence or prove beyond a doubt or whatever the case may be. I mean, I'm open to it. I just think that everything I've looked into seems a little hairy with, oh, we know this for sure. We don't know this for sure. We don't even know what conscious. I don't even think we can all agree on the definition of what consciousness is, let alone pick it out from, what's going on. So I'm led to believe kind of what you were saying, that like our mind or our body is a filter. And this is something I've thought a lot about, that we receive this energy when we're born or whatever the case may be. And it's just this, maybe it's a cycle, and it just keeps, the thing keeps getting recycled back and forth. But I do know that I've had some of my own synchronicities and mystical experiences when I least expected it in at a time of my life. Um, and it actually transformed the way I think about things. I had severe OCD depression, and it was a really bad situation. And through learning about this kind of stuff, meditation, some visionary plant medicine and different things, I was able to kind of pull myself out of it. But I know that there are things, I don't believe in coincidence, if that makes sense. Like I things don't just coincide like that in a way that's like, I'll be talking about something, and then it'll literally happen later that day, or I'll be looking at a clock, and it'll be 11:11, and I was just thinking about the most crazy theoretical idea, and it sends chills down my spine, so things like that. I don't think are an accident, but maybe I'm wrong. But I am open to it just being a product of brain
mhm.
and emotion and hormones and endogenous
Yeah.
chemicals and such.
That's right. And another interesting aspect, going back to the reincarnation with Ian Stevenson's work, he came up with a correlation as well of birthmarks with people who'd been born. And those people sometimes claim to be reincarnations of previous entities. And what he found was there was a correlation with the birthmark on the child's body with the mode of death of the previous incarnation as well. So that is
Wow.
really
That's
fascinating.
creepy.
And he's got some
That's
Yeah,
photos
that's
in
interesting
his
stuff.
book as well that show that as well. And he
yeah.
actually,
I'm not familiar. I'll have to check out his stuff, but that sounds super interesting.
yeah, very interesting.
Would you have anything on the horizons coming up in terms of a book or research or some sort of new thing you're going to try? Is there anything coming up?
Going to be doing some online courses. I'm just in the process. I've got them all written. It's just a process of getting them into an online form, really. And so part of the online courses then there would be live events at different locations as well. So probably start off in the UK doing the live events, but may even then go to the States as well and do some work over there as well. So that would be kind of
Sweet.
next.
Yeah, I
Uh,
mean, I'll pay to come see you talk here in the
Yeah,
United
come
States if you
across the
yeah,
pond. We'll
yeah. Yeah. I think you would hit it out of the park. I think these are very timely topics for what, we see humanity going through, and we're kind of I feel like we're at this point where we're stuck, like there hasn't been an
Material town.
Einstein. Yeah, there hasn't been an Einstein in a while. There hasn't been any major breakthroughs in terms of what we are, who we are. Even Descartes was like one of the last great.
mhm.
I think therefore I am. That's like one of the last great truths, to me. So, um, I think we're at a standing point here, and I think we need to start looking into some other realms of things. I think that's why you see the
Mhm.
psychedelic research with mental disorders, why you see, looking into near death experiences, why you see some of these, what were considered fringe topics at the time now
Yeah.
come, to the surface.
Oh, definitely. Since I've started doing my research, I've seen a massive change in attitude. When I first started back in, 1995, before I did the hospital research, trying to find someone who would share their experience with me was really difficult. People were really afraid to talk about it because they thought that I was going to take the mickey out of them, I was going to laugh at them. Uh, and then when I started doing my hospital research, more and more people took me seriously, and so they would share their experiences. And then in 2006, there was a newspaper article in a national newspaper about my work, and they included my email address. And I had about 600 emails of people sharing their experience. And then when my book, The Wisdom of Near-Death Experience, came out in 2014, it was serialized by a national newspaper in the UK, and it kind of went viral by 9 o'clock in the morning. There were hundreds of comments online, and I didn't look at them because I never kind of look at those sort of things. And my friends who were looking at them said that the majority of the comments were really positive. So I've seen a really big shift. And then as a result of that going viral, I've got over 14,000 emails that I've not yet responded to because people were there. So
That's a
you can
lot,
see
huh?
it is. So if anyone's listening now and I haven't responded, I'm really sorry. I am getting round to it. I'm going to get a research assistant to help me as well. So I should respond to them all within a few years probably. But it's heartening to me to see such a really good shift in attitude as well. And when I started my research in the hospital, initially the doctors and my colleagues were a little bit skeptical about it. But at the end of it, they really understood the value of it as well. And I was lucky enough to work with doctors who were open-minded enough to see that it was a benefit for the patients as well. So I think there's massive shift in attitude to these experiences. And I think the whole world is waking up and it's
Yeah.
it's opening their eyes. And it's really exciting time to be alive, I find, because I think we're on that brink of making new discoveries about what it means to be human.
Oh yeah.
Oh,
Mm.
absolutely. Well, let's wrap it up here. Do you your book I've read The Wisdom of Near Death Experiences. What are some of the other titles of your book so people can find them on Amazon?
There's also the transformative power of near-death experiences, and that looks at people, how their lives have changed as a result of the experience. And there's a little pocket guide of near-death experiences called What is a Near-Death Experience as well. And then if you really want the scientific research, there's this other one there, which is the near-death experiences of hospitalized intensive care patients. But that's more of an academic book, you know. It's the wisdom of near-death experiences is probably kind of a condensed version of that.
Sure. And I wanted to just ask you one more thing before we wrap up here. You helped, I think you said in your book, 4 of your grandparents pass on, you know, through you know, the work that you were doing as a nurse. Did you have, um, obviously you have a more of a connection, they're related to you, but did you see some of the hallmarks
Mhm.
compared to some of the other patients that you had no, you know, connection like that with?
Yeah, I did, especially when my first grandfather was dying. We nursed him at home, and I was lucky enough to be involved in his care. And I can remember it was about a few days before he actually did die. He started pointing to the doorway, and he used to say, "Look who's there, look who's
Hmm.
there." And my grandmother used to get really spooked, and she would run out of the room. And I hadn't started my research at that point, and so I just kind of thought it was a hallucination, and I didn't question him or ask him about it. Now I really wish that I had. But, you know, at the time I just was really skeptical about it. Then when my other grandfather was dying, he knew about my research. So we had long conversations about the research. And, you know, I think it gave him a lot of comfort in his final days as well. And so I was looking for things with him. I was looking for these deathbed visions, but I didn't actually see him because he was quite heavily sedated in the last few hours of his life. So I didn't see anything there. Then with my grandmother, she again was very much aware of my research, and we used to have long conversations about that as well. But no, she didn't have anything obvious that I noticed as she was dying. And the same with my other grandmother as well. She didn't seem to. So yeah, it's a privilege to be in at the bedside of someone as they're dying as well. And I know a lot of people might get a bit, you know, frightened about that or apprehensive about it, but there's nothing to be afraid of. It's the most natural thing in the world. We're all going to die, and it's just a privilege to be there.
Well, that's a hard thing to accept. Most people don't want to die. You know, that's the, I think that's why you see a lot of people into religions and different things. But, well, it was a pleasure having you on. We got to get you back on soon. Everybody go to drpennysartori.com. We're going to put all of her information in the description below. And anything else you want to say or?
No, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for
Thank you.
coming on. I learned a lot.
Yeah.
That was awesome.
Yeah, this was awesome. This is probably one of our more favorite episodes in terms of content. But
Oh yeah.
like I said, thank you for your work. Thank you for coming on. And we'll hopefully have you back on in the future. Dr.
Oh,
Penny
thank you.
Sartori, folks. Thank you.
Thank you.